The observation chamber aboard the Zelthari research vessel hummed with quiet energy, its curved walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that shifted in rhythm with the students' breathing. They sat in a semicircle, their luminous eyes fixed on the holographic projections flickering before them. Footage of human settlements, their chaotic streets teeming with fragile creatures of soft skin and brittle bone. Professor Viren swept a clawed hand through the projection, pausing, on an image of a human emergency ward. And so, he intoned, his deep voice resonant with authority, we conclude that humans, despite their technological progress, fear injury above all else. His gaze settled on his students, gauging their reactions. Silence stretched before. One of them, a young Zelthari named Rylak, shifted on his perch. But they are resilient in other ways, he ventured. His iridescent crest flickered a shade of uncertainty. They survive inhospitable environments. They adapt quickly. Why should they fear injury so much if they are so determined to persist? Another student, Vralin, let out a chittering hum of disapproval. It is not about their adaptability. It is about their physical limitations. Look at them. Exposed musculature, fragile skeletal structure, highly sensitive nerve endings. Their entire physiology is designed for pain avoidance. Unlike our own armored exoskeletons, a single deep wound could incapacitate them. It is logical that they would do everything possible to prevent it. Professor Viren gave an approving nod. Indeed, human history reflects this obsession. Their advancements in medicine, safety regulations, even the very nature of their social structures, all indicate a species that has adapted not by hardiness, but by caution. Rylak remained unconvinced. He turned his gaze toward the main viewport, where the vast expanse of space framed the station below. A human research outpost, small yet efficient, clung to the barren surface of the moon-like planet beneath them. Inside, human scientists worked, unaware that they were being studied. It just seems contradictory, he murmured. A species so fragile yet so daring. Why would a species that fears injury so much willingly put themselves in situations where it is inevitable? They're explorers, they're soldiers, do they not accept danger? Professor Viren exhaled in the manner of their kind, a slow expansion of his throat sacs. They mitigate risk where they can, but ultimately, when pressed, they still succumb to the limits of their biology. Observe carefully in the coming days, students. You will see the truth for yourselves. The assignment was simple. Observe humans in their natural environment and document their reactions to physical harm. If a human became injured, the students were to analyze their response, whether they panicked, sought medical aid, or fell into incapacitation. The hypothesis was clear. Humans, despite their advancements, were fundamentally ruled by fear of pain. The students positioned themselves within the hidden alcoves of the observation deck, their translucent technology allowing them to watch without detection. Below, the research station pulsed with life. Humans moved through the corridors, engaged in their daily routines, oblivious to the scrutiny of alien eyes. Hours passed, days even. The humans operated their machines, communicated in their strange, expressive manner, and, predictably, took great care to avoid any situation that might cause them harm. They handled objects delicately, moved cautiously through hazardous zones, and immediately addressed the smallest injury with antiseptics and bandages. It was exactly as expected. And yet, Rylak remained uneasy. There was something beneath the surface, something that did not align with their theory. He watched as a human engineer, her hands calloused and marred with old scars, handled molten metal with an ease that defied fear. He noted the way a scientist ignored a fresh cut on his arm, too engrossed in his work to acknowledge it until another human pointed it out. These were not the actions of a species consumed by terror. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. It happened in the maintenance sector where a young technician was working to repair a failing power conduit. The students watched as he adjusted the panel, his movements efficient, until his hand slipped. The snap of electricity arcing through flesh was unmistakable. The human jerked back, cursing, his arm seizing from the shock. Rylick tensed, expecting what they had all anticipated. Panic, distress, a frantic call for medical attention. Instead, the technician let out a sharp breath, flexed his fingers experimentally, then shook his hand as though trying to rid it of an inconvenience. He muttered something under his breath, retrieved a worn-out fabric strip from his pocket, and wrapped it around the burn. Then, without hesitation, he resumed his work. The silence in the observation chamber was absolute. Vralin was the first to break it. Why did he not stop? Professor Viren's throat sac fluttered in confusion. Perhaps the injury was not as severe as it appeared. Rylick knew better. The human's skin had been charred at the point of contact. The pain must have been immense, and yet he had barely acknowledged it. Their entire thesis had hinged on the assumption that humans feared injury, that they avoided it at all costs. But what they had just witnessed suggested something entirely different. A thought surfaced in Rylick's mind, one that sent a ripple of unease through his being. What if humans did not fear pain in the way they had assumed? What if they had simply learned to endure it? He turned to Professor Viren, whose usual certainty had faltered into contemplation. "Sir," he asked slowly, "is it possible that we have misunderstood them?" The professor did not answer immediately. He stared at the projection, his gaze fixed on the human technician, who, despite his injury, continued his work without complaint. Finally, Viren spoke. "We must observe further." The lesson was far from over. The research station pulsed with quiet efficiency, its artificial atmosphere carefully regulated to maintain the comfort of its human inhabitants. The Zelthari students remained concealed within their observation chamber, their translucent viewing technology ensuring they could witness every detail without detection. The past days had been filled with endless study, yet Rylick found himself growing increasingly dissatisfied with their conclusions. Something did not align. The humans followed procedures, treated minor injuries with obsessive care, and implemented safety protocols at every turn. These behaviors suggested caution, perhaps even fear, and yet, when actual pain was introduced, when injury struck suddenly and without warning, their responses defied all logic. He had seen it himself in the technician who had burned his hand, barely acknowledging his wound before resuming his task. There had been no panic, no desperate plea for aid, only irritation, followed by immediate adaptation. Still, the students needed undeniable proof. An incident severe enough to strip away all rationalization and force the truth into the open. It came when they least expected it. A warning siren blared through the station, its sharp, rhythmic wail sending humans into swift, rehearsed action. The Zelthari stiffened, their luminous eyes flickering as they adjusted their viewports, scanning the corridors for the source of the commotion. In the maintenance sector, a group of engineers worked frantically to stabilize a malfunctioning conduit. The station's internal systems had detected a pressure imbalance, and if left unchecked, it could trigger an explosive decompression of the sector. Humans rushed to seal emergency panels, voices sharp and clipped as they relayed commands. One of them, a broad-shouldered human clad in the gray uniform of a technician, was moving quickly along a catwalk when the floor beneath him gave a violent shudder. The tremor threw him off balance, his foot slipping against the grated metal. Before he could regain control, the panel beneath him snapped free, and he plunged downward, his body striking the exposed edge of a reinforced beam before he hit the floor below. Rylick flinched. The impact had been brutal. The chamber filled with stunned silence as the students watched the human struggle to push himself up. Blood pooled beneath him, smeared against the floor where he had landed. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, his arm clutching his side where a deep gash darkened his uniform. This was it, the moment of truth. Any rational species, when faced with such an injury, would react with the expected instincts: shock, distress, a cry for immediate assistance. Pain was a universal language, its grip inescapable. But the human did not scream. His breathing was ragged, shallow, but controlled. His expression twisted, not with terror, but with something closer to frustration. His fingers pressed against the wound at his side, testing its severity before his attention shifted to his broken leg. Another human dropped down beside him, their voices hurried but calm. "Orlan, talk to me." The injured technician, Orlan, exhaled sharply, his jaw tight. "Leg's done. Gonna need a splint. Think I cracked a rib." He winced as he shifted. "Damn thing caught me on the way down." The assisting human did not panic. He nodded, already reaching for a medkit clipped to his belt. "Gonna stabilize it here before we move you." "No time," Orlan gritted out. His eyes flicked toward the still malfunctioning conduit, sparks leaping from its exposed circuits. "That thing blows. It's taking half the sector with it." The other human hesitated, clearly weighing their options. Rylick leaned forward, his claws pressing lightly against the control panel as he struggled to understand what was unfolding before him. Orlan's injuries were severe. His body should have been shutting down, prioritizing survival. And yet, his first instinct was not to protect himself, but to ensure the station remained intact. The assisting human shook his head. "You can't move, Orlan." "Then you fix it," Orlan shot back, already reaching for a nearby support beam. His hands curled around it, his arms trembling as he attempted to haul himself upright. Rylick felt his breath still in his chest. The pain must have been unbearable. Yet Orlan forced himself up, sweat beading along his forehead as he gritted his teeth against the agony of his broken limb. He grabbed a tool from his belt, tossing it to his companion. "Just tell me what to do." Professor Viren let out a slow, deliberate exhale. His crest darkened with something unreadable. "Impossible," he murmured. Below, the humans worked in tandem, one stabilizing the conduit while the other, despite his injuries, did what he could to assist. Orlan swayed, his body clearly on the edge of collapse, but he refused to stop. It took less than 3 minutes for the system to stabilize. The alarms ceased. The immediate danger had passed. Only then did Orlan finally allow himself to slump against the wall, his breath ragged. His companion pressed a communicator to his ear. "We need a med team in maintenance. Got a bad fall here." Orlan let out a weak chuckle. Could have been worse. Rylick could not look away. The chamber was silent, the weight of what they had just witnessed settling over them like a heavy fog. This was not the behavior of a species consumed by fear. Pain was present. Injury was real. But it did not dictate human actions. If anything, it seemed secondary, an inconvenience to be pushed aside in favor of duty, necessity, or sheer stubbornness. Vralin's voice was uncharacteristically quiet. They should not be able to endure that. Professor Viren's eyes remained fixed on the screen. His crest pulsed with slow, deliberate thought. "We have been mistaken," he admitted. "Humans do not avoid injury out of fear." Rylick turned toward him, his mind racing. If fear of pain did not govern human behavior, then what did? What force was powerful enough to drive a wounded individual to push beyond their limits, to continue even when every biological instinct should have demanded they stop? Professor Viren's next words sent a ripple of unease through the chamber. They fear something far greater than pain itself. The silence in the observation chamber was a heavy, living thing. It clung to the Zelthari students, pressing against their crests, settling in the spaces between their thoughts. No one spoke. No one moved. The screen still flickered with the image of the injured human below, now being lifted onto a stretcher by his companions. His body was battered, broken in ways that should have left him writhing, unconscious, or at the very least unwilling to move. And yet, He had moved. He had acted. Rylick's mind churned, replaying every moment in perfect clarity. Orlan had been in agony. That much was undeniable. But what unsettled Rylick most was not that the human had endured the pain. It was that he had chosen to endure it, not for survival, not out of necessity alone, but because something else had been more important than his own suffering. Vreeland was the first to speak, his voice brittle. "This does not make sense." His claws tapped against the console, a nervous, erratic pattern. Pain is meant to deter. It is the body's command to stop, to seek preservation. What kind of species ignores such a command? Professor Viren inhaled slowly, his throat sac expanding. His gaze remained fixed on the screen. "We have misunderstood them," he said at last. Rylick turned toward him. "Then what is the truth?" The professor's luminous eyes flickered. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the display. Below, Orlan's fellow humans moved with practiced ease, securing his injuries, ensuring he was stable before transport. The moment of crisis had passed, and yet their focus had not wavered. "Observe," Viren instructed. "What do you see?" The students hesitated. The answer should have been obvious. An injured human, others tending to him, the remnants of a crisis fading into routine. But Rylick knew that was not what their professor was asking. He forced himself to look beyond the surface, beyond the injury, beyond the pain. The other humans had not treated Orlan with pity. There was no sign of distress in their movements, no panic, no hesitation. They had trusted him to continue his work even after his injury, and he had trusted them in return, to finish what he could not, to help him when his body finally failed. It is not fear that drives them, Rylick realized, the words forming slowly, deliberately. It is each other. Professor Viren inclined his head slightly. Elaborate. Rylick's mind raced, the pieces finally locking into place. Pain is a deterrent, he said, echoing Vreeland's earlier words. But for humans, it is not an absolute. They do not avoid it because they fear suffering itself. They avoid it because it hinders their purpose, and when they cannot avoid it, when injury is inevitable, they endure it for something greater than themselves. He gestured toward the screen. For their duty, for those who rely on them. The realization sent a ripple through the group. Vreeland's crest flattened, his discomfort palpable. But that is irrational. His mandibles clicked in frustration. To willingly suffer, to push past the limits of one's own body, it risks permanent damage. It risks death. And yet, they do it, Professor Viren said softly. The weight of those words settled over them like a cold shadow. Rylick exhaled slowly. We assumed their fragility made them weak, he murmured, but their fragility is precisely why they are strong. It was the contradiction that had eluded them all this time. The human body was fragile, easily wounded, vulnerable in ways the Zelthari could scarcely comprehend. And yet, they had built their civilization atop that fragility. Not in spite of it, but because of it, because they had to. Pain alone did not rule them. Injury was not a master they obeyed. What guided them was something deeper, something woven into the fabric of their being, this unspoken, unbreakable bond to one another. Rylick recalled the way Orlan had gritted his teeth and thrown himself back into his work, not for glory, not for some abstract sense of self-preservation, but because he refused to let his people down. Even broken and bleeding, his first thought had been of the station, of his duty, of those who needed him. A species that feared injury would never act that way. A species that feared failure would. A chill ran down Rylick's spine. He suddenly understood. Humans were not driven by the avoidance of pain. They were driven by the fear of being insufficient, of being the weak link, of letting others suffer in their place. It was not physical endurance that made them formidable. It was the simple, terrifying fact that they would rather break themselves than allow their companions to fall. And that, Rylak realized, made them far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. Professor Viren studied his students, gauging the weight of their understanding. Finally, he exhaled, his crest dimming to a contemplative hue. Our research was flawed, he admitted. We sought to understand their pain tolerance when we should have been asking why they tolerate pain at all. The chamber remained silent, the hum of the station suddenly distant. Vralin looked uneasy. "What do we do with this knowledge?" Professor Viren turned back toward the screen where Orlan, battered but alive, was being carried away. "We learn," he said simply, "and we proceed with caution. Because if humans were willing to endure this much for each other, what then would they endure for something they truly feared losing?" The station's artificial lights cast a dim glow over the observation chamber, but the Zelthari students hardly noticed. Their minds were too entangled in the revelation unraveling before them. Rylak's breathing was slow, measured though. His thoughts were anything but. The moment played over and over in his mind. Orlan, battered and bleeding, forcing himself upright, despite every signal in his body screaming at him to stop. Not because he was reckless, not because he lacked self-preservation, but because something greater than pain had driven him forward. Professor Viren had not spoken for some time. He had let them sit in silence, let them process what they had witnessed without interruption. But now, as the weight of their realization settled in, he finally turned to face them. His crest pulsed with unreadable thoughts. "We were arrogant," he said at last. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the chamber like a heavy tide. "We assumed that humans feared pain above all else, that their fragility made them weak." No one responded. There was no need. The professor exhaled, his gaze shifting toward the display once more. Below, the injured human had been taken away, and yet the others continued their work. No lingering fear, no hesitation. The crisis had passed, and the IE station still stood. Rylak swallowed. "They do not fear pain," he murmured. The words felt strange in his mouth, so contrary to everything they had believed. "They fear failing each other." Vralin's claws curled against the console. He had been the most vocal about human frailty before, but now his posture was guarded. He did not deny it. He could not. Professor Viren regarded them all, carefully. "What does this tell you?" Rylak hesitated, then chose his words carefully. "It means that pain is not a deterrent for them, that suffering alone is not enough to break them." He exhaled slowly. "Which means they will go further, fight longer, and endure more than we ever assumed possible." The professor nodded once. "And that makes them dangerous." The thought sent a shiver through the room. They had studied war histories, analyzed conflicts across countless species. The Zelthari understood strategy, understood the logic of retreat, of surrender, when the losses became too great. It was natural. It was rational. But humans did not stop when logic dictated they should. They fought past breaking points. They continued. If they did not fear pain, if injury did not deter them, then what force could ever make them yield? The realization settled deep in Rylak's bones. They would rather suffer, he murmured, than let someone else bear that burden. It was not just duty, not just survival. It was a kind of relentless, self-inflicted responsibility that defied all reason. A human in pain would endure it if it meant sparing another. A wounded human would push forward because they had to, because failure was worse than suffering. That was why Orlan had moved. That was why no one had stopped him, because they had all understood. Professor Viran folded his hands behind his back. We must rethink everything. No one disagreed. The Zelthari had come here to study humanity's weaknesses, to dissect their limitations, to understand what made them vulnerable. Instead, they had uncovered something far more unsettling. Humans were fragile, but fragility had not made them weak. It had made them endure. Relik met his professor's gaze. He knew now why Viren had remained so composed, why he had let them struggle with this realization on their own. The professor had known all along. They had not come here to confirm humanity's weaknesses. They had come here to understand why, despite those weaknesses, humanity thrived. And now, at last, they had their answer. It was not their strength that made them formidable. It was the terrifying reality that they refused to break.